Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Finish Line, Navigating the Journey After Residency. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Sherman, pediatrician and physician coach, and I'm thrilled today to have a good friend of mine as my guest, Dr. Christopher Kodama. Christopher, how you doing today?
I'm very well, thanks, Joe, and I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks for taking the time. So, Christopher and I go way back, back in the early 2000s, more than 20 years ago, where we were both pediatricians working as pediatric hospitalists in a hospital in Tacoma, Washington. But since that time, Christopher has moved on to bigger and greater things. He's the founder and principal consultant for EverSpark, which is a strategy, advising, consulting practice that where he uses all of his experience, both as a physician and a healthcare executive, to try to consult with individuals and healthcare organizations in all kinds of areas of change and trying to adjust to the ever expanding and changing healthcare environment. So he has 25 years of experience as a CEO, healthcare executive, physician leader. Again, he was a pediatrician turned healthcare executive and business leader, entrepreneur, consultant. Christopher has done it all. So really looking forward to talking to Christopher about kind of what his career path has been and kind of how he got to where he is. So that's where I want to start, Christopher. Tell us a little bit about where you are now and how your career path kind of unfolded.
Sure, thanks for that very generous introduction, Joe. Hopefully I can live up to that during the conversation here and share a pearl or two with the audience. I will start by saying when I was in medical school and residency, I never would have envisioned myself being where I am, doing what I'm doing today. And part of that has to do with relatively early on, realizing that I was never going to be that person that said, in 5 years, I'm going to be doing X, Y, or Z, or I'm going to have this title or be in this position or this type of role. It was more about remaining open to the universe, which has its pros and cons. We can kind of dive more into that later on in terms of what it means to take a less structured approach to navigating one's way through a career path. As you mentioned, I started out in full-time clinical practice, though I'll also note that during my residency period as a chief resident, in my particular program, the chief resident program, the role was very administratively focused. So it gave me an early introduction to some of the more operations and business concepts of medicine. And then I sort of set that aside, continued on my path as a full-time pediatric hospitalist, which is when we first met. Did that for a while, was pulled into, as part of that program, we were each requested to participate in some form or fashion in an administrative function on behalf of a group of hospitalists. And that was sort of the extent of anything beyond clinical for me. As time progressed and there was sort of shuffling of deck chairs, medical leaders coming and going or needing to step away temporarily, occasionally I would be asked to step in as like an interim medical director here or there. And then ultimately, the person that I think hired us both into the program approached me with the opportunity to step in to a full-time medical director management position for the Children's Hospital on an interim basis. And so we spent quite a bit of time talking about what that was. She had done it in the past, so she had some firsthand experience and some wisdom and guidance that I wanted to tap into. And we also met with other leaders with whom I would be working in that capacity, just so I kind of had a sense of what I might be walking into. Very challenging. I would call it a crucible moment, trial by fire, making that transition into less of the clinical and more of the intersection with the business side of medicine. But I love to learn things and I love variety, and there was plenty of that. And ultimately, at the core of what drives me is a passion around creating clarity out of chaos, which was a large part of why I pursued the specialty of pediatric hospitalist medicine in particular. Is you're in an environment where there's a lot of different inputs coming at you, ranging from specialists and their lab tests and diagnostics. You have the family, the nursing staff, ancillary services, et cetera. And your job really becomes almost like a traffic cop directing traffic, or an air traffic controller, where you're trying to synthesize all of this information, eliminate background noise and confusion, and then create a comprehensive care plan that everybody can understand from their respective points of view and get behind in terms of helping the patient get better. And in the management side of things, in that particular role, what it taught me was that I still had an opportunity to really tap into that passion, because it's no less chaotic on the management side than it is on the clinical side at times.
Uh, Christopher, let me just ask you a question, just kind of along the way there. So you're saying that during residency as a chief resident, you started to get kind of more interested in the administrative business side of things. And then how did you decide to kind of from that experience, how did you decide to become a hospitalist first? I mean, obviously people don't jump from residency, especially in a primary care residency, from that to being an administrator right out. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some people might. But for you, you chose to be a hospitalist as opposed to going into private practice or a fellowship. What about that first decision?
Sure. That first decision was largely driven by where my interests resided clinically. I liked the acute care environment. Um, I also liked managing a sicker patient population, but being able to interact with them as well. And I think a lot of times in intensive care unit settings, it's a little harder to get that degree of dynamic interaction. It's a different and much deeper level of intensity, as the name would suggest. So, hospitalist medicine on inpatient wards was more appealing to me. It also helped with some of the things I've referenced before, my interests, though I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at the time, around creating clarity out of chaos. But the variety
Yeah.
was really important to me in retrospect. I couldn't really describe it effectively at the time, but I knew what it felt like, and it didn't feel like well child preventative continuity of care type of activity. Not that that wasn't important. I just recognized early on that I was going to need something to kind of fuel myself in
Mm-hmm.
a different way. So that's how I landed on pediatric hospitalist medicine. And that track really kind of takes you down a path where it was relatively new as a specialty at the time. And the to the extent that there were programs out there, they were largely a model where you would be employed by the hospital where you worked.
Yeah.
Now, since then, there's been a proliferation of what I would call staffing companies, where you could join an organization that provides that level of service to healthcare systems and hospitals. It's a different kind of dynamic that wasn't readily apparent to me. It certainly didn't exist for pediatric hospitalist medicine at the
Mm-hmm.
time. So it's a little bit of timing and circumstance, Joe.
Yeah. So you kind of fell into this first opportunity to be an administrator
That's correct.
as you were a hospitalist. How many years were you working as a hospitalist before you took on that first administrative role?
Relatively brief, and it kind of goes back to your previous question about the original exposure to administrative work as a chief resident, but then staying focused on the clinical side. And at that point in my career journey, I was very focused on being a physician, a
Mm,
practicing physician, delivering care, interacting with patients. And you invest so much time and energy. I mean, you think about pre-medical education or post-baccalaureate, and then you're in medical school, then you go through residency. There's a zillion different hoops, it feels like at times, in terms of different exams to get there. So to just jettison that and not put it to work for myself didn't feel right to me initially. But I will say the opportunity for the management position fell into my lap about 5 years into clinical practice.
Hmm.
So for some, that's a relatively brief period of time in which to exercise all of that investment I just referred to in your clinical training.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I felt for sure, and I have also observed in many who have been presented with career transitions from clinical to whatever else, whether that's a hospital management job or something else, is the depth to which my personal identity was tied to that credential,
Yeah.
which I think is something we can't underestimate enough as physicians. I think it's been underappreciated or underrecognized in many venues, and you see this manifest in really challenging ways for physicians who are transitioning to retirement or wanting to transition and pull back on their clinical time, or they've had some sort of a life altering event or a medical condition that precludes them from practicing the type of medicine they wanted to practice. I mean, these really are different examples of triggering this identity question about who am I and what are the vehicles that I have available to me to exercise and contribute, exercise my skills and contribute.
Not, yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. And not only the identity, but just thinking about going from being that front lines hospitalist, pediatrician with your fellow clinicians to going to the dark side of the
Yeah.
administrative C suite, or maybe we're in the C suite right away, but at least going to administration. So that's something else, a transition, and I don't know, you can describe that first kind of like entree into your administrative role. Did you hold on to some of your clinical role? How did you deal with that idea of moving over to administration? How did your colleagues deal with you moving over to administration?
Oh, really great questions, Joe. I'd say I had the benefit in my transition, my first transition into a management role, of doing so within an organization where I was already known for my clinical practice.
Hmm.
So it, the good news is I had pre-existing relationships and ones that were of mutual respect for one another's clinical acumen and decision making. To a
Hmm.
certain extent, you get familiar with each other's personality styles and whatnot. So that all helped. What was challenging about that is because I knew these people so deeply in that context, to suddenly switch roles where now I'm being expected to be uh, a marker of accountability for them, both on things that they were already doing as well as things maybe that they weren't aware that they could be doing better.
Hmm.
And that was sort of fascinating to me and a little
Yeah.
bit stressful. I'll say my colleagues were really quite supportive about it, because although there were a lot of jokes about quote unquote the dark side, which we probably ought to unpack a little bit about what that means and maybe why people think of it that way. But um, generally, the sense that I had was that they felt that they would have somebody who was sympathetic and understood what they were experiencing on the front line of clinical care as sort of that translator into the business and the management side
Hmm.
of things. So, which is something else that I really love to do, is about, again, creating that clarity, but through working with people, understanding the different dialects that people are speaking. And in this space, we're talking about the dialects of clinical care. And as we know, across specialties, there's some distinctions there as well as non-physician clinical providers. There's those dialects of nursing, et cetera. And then, of course, on the business side, there are any number of dialects of business ranging from finance to information technology, operations, strategy, marketing. So it was an interest when I talk about variety and loving learning. Wow, was this like the deep end of all of those things? So that was sort of what was going on in my mind. And I continued part time clinical practice really on a very limited basis for the first few years of my full time management responsibilities. I know that there are many physician leaders out there who are able to balance both long term.
Hmm.
And these are people who might be hospital or health system CEOs, and they're still seeing patients in clinic or pulling a shift here or there on the
Hmm.
inpatient wards um, in perpetuity. What I was finding for myself was my own personal standard that I held myself accountable to in terms of what it looked like to be effective and be doing a good job and my all for that which was in front of me at any given time was getting diluted. So the notion of doing my clinical work really well, staying abreast of the group practice standards, making sure that any group performance metrics, that I wasn't jeopardizing those because I wasn't as present as I used to be, along with the performance associated with my new management duties, which were very new to me in a lot of ways, and a lot of long hours and things that I did I might have done differently knowing what I know now. But this deep immersion, long hours of trying to enhance my understanding of those concepts so that I could be that effective intermediary between the clinical side of things and the management side of things. And then, of course, let's not forget one's personal life. What does one do outside of your professional identity?
Yeah.
And I was finding that when I say diluted, I mean, as opposed to diluted, um, that I wasn't really doing a good job of any of those things
Ah.
because I was feeling stretched a little too thinly. Maybe it was because I had unrealistic expectations of what I needed to deliver in each of those spaces. Um, that that's where I chose over time, long story, a little less long, to start ratcheting further down on my clinical practice until I was exclusively focused on management. Now, I continue to maintain my board certification in pediatrics. I do my maintenance of certification activities, all of those sorts of things, maintain my state medical license. But I think if I were to go back into clinical practice, going back to those standards for myself that I was referring to, I probably would need some proctoring and
Yeah.
definitely so much has changed, the
Yeah.
past 15 to 20 years. Um, that I want to make, like technology, workflows, all of those sorts of things that I
Yeah.
would want to make sure that I was feeling pretty steady on those legs before I went off on my own. So that's kind of a little bit
Yeah.
of, hopefully answer your question.
Christopher, I'm really curious about, and I have quite a few physician clients as a coach who have moved from that clinical world to the administrative world. And so you, as you move through there and you moved into your administrative role, what can you just kind of briefly tell me the chronology of the different positions that you had with that first organization you were with?
Sure. So the children's hospital where we worked clinically, and then that I took the lead as a medical director, I was partnered with a non-physician nurse leader in running um, that area. Was part of a larger, what we call enterprise, or what these days integrated healthcare delivery system that was comprised of numerous hospitals, clinics, other sites of care that spanned the age continuum through adulthood. So when I first started my management career, it was focused very specifically on the children's hospital. Over time, that became more of an enterprise role, initially looking at pediatric services across the entirety of the health system, beyond the walls of the bricks and mortar of the children's hospital. So, looking at newborn nursery care practices and standards, different special care nursery standards at some of the community hospitals that were not children's hospitals per se, but still had children coming in and out of them, or children coming through the emergency departments. There was a period of time where it was very in vogue to have satellite hospitalist programs at community hospitals, non-children's community hospitals. So was involved with leading the development of that. Over time, that then moved beyond pediatrics to sort of the continuum of care across all ages and specialties. My focus at that phase was really on what we call clinical operations, or the marriage of the business and the clinical best practice delivery in the various facilities of the healthcare system. And that could range from a lot of different things. One day I would be sitting in on strategy development meetings to figure out how we were going to grow patient population and encounters in a particular area or service line, to helping with implementation of electronic health records, which was very much a thing back when I was cutting my
Oh
teeth on
yeah.
the
Yeah.
management side when these were still quite new, from an enterprise perspective. And then, of course, managing performance. And then from there, actually, what's sort of interesting is, this is maybe over 10 years ago now, I was thinking it might be time to start putting my foot in the consulting end of the pool.
Already.
And
Well,
then
at
I,
first, let me interrupt you just for a second,
sure.
because at no point in time there did you say, you said medical director once, but kind of the classic labels I think of is, medical director, associate chief medical officer,
Mhm.
chief medical officer, vice president. But you haven't named any of those labels yet, other than medical director. So I'm curious whether you had some type of hybrid
Mm.
uh, role there.
So, what's interesting about that question for me, Joe, is I guess I don't put a whole lot of stock by titles because I find that they tend to have more internal meaning to an organization than they do more broadly. So I'll give you an example. At one point, one of my titles was vice president, or medical vice president of clinical operations. Well, how do you explain that to somebody
Right.
about what that means? So that's kind of an interesting oversight on my part. So thanks for calling that out. The second thing is there are some traditional physician leadership roles. We think about medical director, associate medical director, vice president of medical affairs, chief medical officer, et cetera, which are very valid and important roles. And there's some thought work that I have shared with others in this space about how you create an appropriate right fit type of physician leadership role for both that individual and for your organization. But I think sometimes we forget that physicians can be more than the MD or DO credential after their name. And so you see physicians in some of these other less conventional roles, such as um, chief information officers, or CEOs or chief operating officers, those sorts of things. And so um, as I moved through kind of this nebulous zone of titling, um, in a way, what it taught me was the flexibility and the importance of being open to different projects and opportunities, and which also kind of aligned with my tendencies towards generalist medicine.
Hmm.
So it was more of a generalist, both as a clinician as well as leader, executive.
Yeah.
And then, when I was about to jump into that consulting gig, I sort of got sidetracked. I like to call it my 10-year detour into population health, which I had very little experience with as an acute care physician, where population health is very driven from an outpatient perspective. And yet I was being tasked with standing up clinically integrated networks, launching new accountable care organizations, helping with healthcare transformation activities in that space, which I did for another 10 years. And that's when I started taking on some of those more conventional titles like president, CEO, so on and so
Okay.
forth.
All right. So I guess my question, so you're one of these Renaissance people. You want to take it all on and kind of like this variety of different things. As a physician who's making that transition, and all of a sudden now you are shoulder to shoulder with the MBAs and the MHAs and all the other letters other than MD and DO after your name. A lot of times, if I have a client who's an MD that moves into those roles, that client's first thought is, oh my God, I'm going to be discovered that I really don't know what these business terms are. I got to go get my MBA. I've got to go get another degree. How did you navigate that? Did you get another degree? Did you feel like in order for me to be effective in this area that I need further training, or did you do it on your own? Tell me about that journey.
Sure, I'd say a little bit of all of those things, Joe. And um, first, one of the first things that I thought about when you asked that question was, I think it's kind of true for me anyway, and I suspect there are others out there that might have experienced this sensation as well, or what we commonly refer to as the imposter syndrome. I know I felt that way probably particularly as a medical student when I was being sent in to interview patients and gather the H&P. But throughout my career, you're kind of in your training portion of your clinical career, you're sort of in this interesting limbo space, especially as a resident. You have the letters after your name, and yet you're not fully independent. And so establishing yourself as credible in the eyes of the people with whom you work, particularly the patients and families, is sort of an interesting um, setting in terms of this concept of imposter syndrome. Then your first job out of residency, where now in some ways you kind of feel like the safety net has been removed and you're kind of out there, the training wheels on your bike are gone. And if you fall, it's on you. There's that sort of transition. So in a way, this wasn't all that different when I moved into management. So it was present. I'm not going to deny the fact that there were times where I'd look around the room thinking, how did I get here?
Yeah.
And how am I being perceived? And um, part of that really comes from within, in terms of developing a degree of confidence in yourself. I chose to start by focusing on, I have done things that tell me are tangible proof points that I can lean into challenge and I can learn. So medical school residency is not an easy feat. And I oftentimes tell people, if you can live through that and the long hours and having to make critical life altering decisions while you're sleep deprived, it puts it all into perspective. So every now and then I found myself going back to that thinking, no matter how challenging or contentious a management conversation or project was, I have actually held, 425-gram infants, newborns in my hand and helped save their lives. So it kind of, sometimes you just have to rely on those things, even though they're not necessarily a one-to-one translation, but just to anchor yourself. The second thing that comes to mind is I'm a big fan of the concept of what I call multifluency. So the ability to learn different languages and
Mm-hmm.
dialects,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily in the literal sense, but as we were talking about before, when you start into clinical practice, it's medical school and residency. It's all about learning the language. It's about learning the nuance and how to put all of those things together, much as it is if you were learning a new language. And so moving into management, it wasn't all that different, though I felt like the time and the intention in that formally existed to help me develop that was not there.
Mm.
And it still continues to be, I think, a bit of a gap for physicians transitioning into the management side of things. In fact, I'm working on a research project right now that I'm hoping I can come back and pick your brain about at some point, Joe, around how to create not only sustainable physician leaders, but how to do that in a way that minimizes fatigue and burnout. Because we
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of clinicians who are kind of caught up in the spirit of the perceived prestige of a leadership position or a role. It's not always really clear. All of these roles are very different in what they're looking for, oftentimes, both technically as well as stylistically. So, trying to figure that out while you're on the job. I'm a pretty kinesthetic learner, so I was okay with that. I
Mm-hmm.
recognize that other people they appreciate more structure, more of the didactic. So I do know folks who said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need some sort of formal training. So they go back to an MBA program or executive advanced degree program in business or public health or something like that. Actually, interestingly, I did the immersive learning track for 4 years before I even went and got my MBA. And
Yeah.
frankly, the idea of going back into a structured academic learning environment was sort of anathema to me because I'm like, my 12 years of pre-med all the way through residency, haven't I paid the piper enough?
Yeah.
And it kind of fell into my lap. I was fortunate in having some friends and mentors who were like, you're going to do this and we're going to make it easy as possible for you to do it. So just get over yourself and buckle down and get the degree. And
Yeah.
the purpose of that degree was to take the immersive learning and be able to put terminology and start to link concepts that I hadn't yet grasped
Hmm.
through the doing. And I have to say, it was very helpful in terms of establishing my relationships with my business colleagues in two ways. One is I would go to these folks, like one of my friends was in finance within the organization, and she helped me with my accounting homework. It was kind of like my tutor. And then as we kind of moved up the ranks, she became CFO, and then she moved on to another organization to be the CFO. Like, you have these relationships, and she would started to come to me and say, how do we translate this in a way that's going to be palatable for physicians? Like, what are the physician considerations? So it kind of opened up that door. And then I think, second of all, the proof was in the pudding. So as I began to produce deliverables, projects, reports, recommendations, proposals to my business colleagues, the added benefit of some of those more standardized, structured lessons from the business school track began to manifest.
Yeah.
And so then it was my way of really trying to push back against the ceiling we experience as physicians in leadership positions, that we can only manage physicians.
Hmm.
Whereas, and sometimes that's what's required and what a job needs, is you need somebody who's more of a patient safety and clinical quality oriented physician. You might
Hmm.
need somebody who's more involved in the technical and data side, or maybe you need somebody who's more business inclined. So I'm not saying there's only one way to do it. There are a variety of different ways to slice and dice your interests. If this is something that people who are tuning in to this podcast are thinking about, you don't have to go 100% all in and go back to business school. You can do part-time medical directorships. You can do voluntary leadership positions. And there are different ways, depending on your learning style and the investment versus benefit of more structured and formal training,
Hmm.
that are worth considering.
I love your little vignette there about the ultimate CFO and the accounting homework and everything, because it really points out your ability to be vulnerable to someone who comes from the culture of administration and business, to say, hey, I really don't know the accounting and I'm trying to learn it. Can you help me out? And then that humility and vulnerability then allows the other person from the other camp, the culture of business, to say, please help me out to understand this aspect of clinical care or medicine that I really need to understand in order to put things together to do my job well. And I find that when I work with physicians who are trying to figure out, how do I keep my physician hat on and enter the C suite or the management executive wing, is this whole idea that we all have gifts and talents. We all come from different cultures, but it's that fluency that you're talking about, that idea to really be able to be open, vulnerable, and willing to learn from each other. I love that example, because otherwise we're just all going to be banging heads against each other thinking that, the good guys and the bad guys.
Yeah. Which is kind of what we were alluding to before when you think about the use of the term the dark side. I think
Yeah.
a lot of times what that is a reflection of is exactly that polarity. Two different, to use your term, camps that may actually be trying to accomplish more in common than they realize. But I like to say, 90%, it's not based on scientific study, but 90% of conflict oftentimes arises from either people using the same terminology to refer to different concepts, or using different terminology to refer to the same concept. And, it's sort of, when I look at the people practicing medicine on the front line and the business folks, there's a role for both. And, what gets in the way a lot of times, number one, is that lack of fluency or an understanding of the symbiosis that really needs to exist between those two poles. And I think there's also something here that goes back to the identity component. because I don't know that I appreciated this so much, having been so immersed with other physicians, going through training, working with them on the front lines. Um, the notion of being a physician can actually be quite intimidating to non-physicians. And I know this probably doesn't come as a surprise to our audience when you think about patient interactions, though I am somewhat surprised at the ongoing degree of deference that the lay public practices towards physicians, when in reality we don't know it all. And it's a team sport. We're really in some ways almost like a coach, where we're trying to extract the truth from a variety of different sources rather than always being the ones to go straight to the solution. But I find that that is sort of an interesting space to explore, where a non-physician administrator or a business person will oftentimes glom on to their identity, their professional identity, as a grounding mechanism, just as I talked about referring to my clinical background as a grounding for my transition into the unknown of administration. But, I think that there are a lot of assumptions sometimes that go, or unspoken assumptions about who the other people are, how they think or how they operate. So you hear, oh, physician on the business side, physicians, they just, they don't care about how to make a sustainable business model. They just want to, cure the world and all this sort of stuff. And on the physician side, it's sort of like the administration just worries about the bottom line and making money. And, somewhere in between, there's a shared truth in there. But what is it that has to be true in order to get parties to that conversation? I think part of it is a recognition that the world is bigger than your own sphere, recognition and the humility that you were referring to before, that you may not know everything there is to know. And then the intentional cultivation of relationships across that aisle. Because once you start seeing people as fellow human beings that have families, perhaps, or children, pets, have hobbies, it takes on a very different dimension than when they're just the suit and tie or business suit, or they're the person in the scrubs with the stethoscope around their neck.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely true. We are like running out of time here. I wanted just kind of like, as we kind of come to the end, how, if there is a physician who is early on in practice and say whether they're a specialist or in primary care, and they're perhaps thinking, I don't know if I want to just be taking care of patients for my entire career. I might want to be expanding. Do you have any advice for them? Is there anything like, if you find this interest or if you see this interest or whatever, you may consider this or that?
Sure. So the first is, if you think you have an interest, this might seem obvious to some, but identify people who are doing that type of work or have moved down that space if possible, and start picking their brain, ask them questions, because sometimes that's going to give you further insight. That's either going to validate, cause you to want to proceed with learning more, or it may actually redirect you in a different path that you hadn't considered before. The second thing that I might recommend, regardless of whether or not you're interested in, for example, a management career, I think one of the things, I think it's getting better, but from a medical education perspective, there's precious little afforded to the topic of how does actually healthcare operate and run in this country. And I'm not talking about a deep dive business course, but this introduction to the holistic, a grand tour of the holistic healthcare ecosystem as a context, so that wherever you are, whether you're going straight into clinical practice or you have questions about what else is out there, you have a broader understanding of how that fits in to how American healthcare works, for better or for worse, in this country. And there are some courses online. I'm happy to share those with you, Joe, to share with when you post this or not. In fact, I just went through one that was more focused on AI and healthcare, but the first module, because it was open to more than healthcare executives and physicians, was a 9-hour course on introduction to healthcare. And it walks you through, here's what a healthcare provider does and the different types. Here's what an insurance company does. Here's how insurance payments are made.
Wow.
Here's the role of self-funded plan sponsors, pharmacy. This is how it fits into the broader ecosystem. Some of the economics behind the clinical and safety aspects, and how you engage with the patients and the populations that you serve. And there are different options like that available that I might recommend to anybody. Not just if you're looking outside, but that definitely adds some additional consideration and context for exploration. If you
Mhm.
do kind of have this sense of not quite sure if this is where I see myself going for the rest of my career. The other thing that I might recommend is more internal self work, and that is beginning. I wish I had begun the conversation or had somebody prompting me when I was coming out of residency to talk a little bit more explicitly about how I viewed what my interests, passions, and strengths were. So to really kind of galvanize or crystallize that concept, you know, I wish somebody had said, "What are your superpowers?" or "What's your superpower?" Which I think these days, particularly in the Marvel and DC universe that surrounds us all the time, is a much easier concept than it was, 20, 30 years ago. But nevertheless, this idea of a superpower is a reflection of things that get you excited, that you're good about, that you are good at doing, and that gets you excited. Because I think that helps color a variety of different decisions you may choose to make in your career, including what if I'm a medical student, what specialty do I want to pursue?
Yeah.
And once I'm in that specialty, is there a fellowship or subspecialty, or is there something beyond the clinical care that I would want to pursue, like public health interests or management or regulatory stuff, or all of those sorts of things that will really help kind of keep you grounded. And I'm coming to
Yeah.
that, and that's an ongoing conversation, but I find myself coming to that much later in my career, and I kind of wished I'd had it earlier on.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to have you back. We'll continue this conversation because I really want to delve more into this idea of even making choices and all the different avenues you can take as a physician of private practice, employment, all the different options. I wish they had that on. Well, I don't know. Online didn't exist when I was in residency, so I guess it wouldn't have existed then. But these days it does. So having any type of introduction to the economics of healthcare, period, in the business of healthcare would have been tremendously helpful. But I do want to end, and we'll again continue this conversation. So I do want to ask you one more question. If you were to go back and talk to that young pediatric resident emerging out into become a hospitalist, any advice that you would give him?
I think if I were talking to
To your
myself,
younger self, yeah.
yes, my younger self, I would actually reiterate the importance of keeping an open mind.
Hmm.
Staying focused and present, stay focused and present in the steps in front of you, because sometimes that is all that's needed, is just to put one foot in front of the other. I know there are a lot of motivational speakers and there's a lot of content out there that talks about start with the end in mind, set goals, manifest, all of that sort of stuff. And that's important too. But I also recall feeling a bit overwhelmed. And sometimes I look back to those days and think to myself, how did I figure this out?
Yeah,
And I think part of that sometimes is just look at the next step you have to take and take it. And each time you start moving down that path, periodically look up and see where you are, take stock. That's part of the keep an open mind perspective, because
hmm,
things change for us. Life circumstances, interests, passions, they evolve over time. So what was important to me then doesn't necessarily apply later on. As I shared with you in the beginning, talking to that past younger me who never would have imagined that I am where I am,
yeah,
doing what I'm doing. Um, I don't think I would go back and say, here's what you need to go back and get your business degree at this
yeah,
point, do this and this. It would be more of a meta level kind of do some thought work, figure out what your superpowers are, because that's going to keep you grounded, put one foot in front of the other, until it starts to manifest for yourself, and you keep an open mind by looking around and adjusting as you go.
I love that. I love keeping the open mind, living a reflective life. Don't just kind of put your head down and just do everything that everybody else is telling you to do. Really pay attention to who you are and what excites you.
Well, Joe, one last comment on that
Yeah,
just in my head was, I think a lot of times when people do put their head down and they don't look up or have that reflective moment, well, I've seen this and spoken with so many colleagues who look up 10, 20, 30 plus years later, and they're like, what happened? Where did the time go? What do I have to show for it? And it became really apparent in those conversations that, for better or for worse, there weren't a lot of those reflective inflection points where it was sort of like, 10 years in, I thought about X, Y, and Z and did a pulse check with myself before I kept going.
yeah,
I
yeah,
did hear a lot of I wished I had kind of statements in that
sure.
regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, Christopher, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us and being a guest. And like I say, uh, I'll have to have you back and continue this conversation. And because you've done so many different things, I mean, now you're kind of in the consulting world. And speaking of that, as we close, if people want to get in touch with you or find out more about Everspark, can you tell us about that?
Sure. So you can always go to my website, www.everspark. It's with a Q, by the way, EBERSPARQ.com. Or you can email me directly. So in the podcast headline, hopefully my name will be spelled in there, and it's first name dot last name at everspark.com. So Christopher.Kodama at everspark.com. Or if it's easier for you to remember, info at everspark.com will work just fine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we'll have more information about that in the show notes. So thank you so much. And thank you all out there for joining me today on Beyond the Finish Line, how to navigate the journey after residency, and remember to take care of yourselves. Thank you so much.